Hey, folks, welcome back to another episode of Talk Track, a Telegraph podcast where we talk about and respond to the events of the day that affect the railroading community. And by the railroading community, we mean railroads, shippers, equipment owners, 3PLs, terminals, and everybody that comes together to make the world of freight railroading move. So I'm joined today by David Carell, and we're going to be jamming through the next installment, which is now our third of the market consist. Dave, live from Boston, how we feeling this morning?
Feeling great. Feeling sympathetic to you. I know you've been traveling all over the country leading into this, so appreciate the time we get to talk through what we've been working on.
I was super excited about this conversation. It's been interesting because there's been a lot of kind of broader uncertainty in the geopolitical landscape, and it feels like we're constantly responding to forecasts or ideas. Something may happen, something doesn't happen. And so I think one of really the founding principles that we had Telegraph was how do we actually simplify all of the complexity that is going on, not necessarily just in the world, but more localized to freight railroading. And so we're now in this kind of third version of these quarterly outlooks that you've been really shepherding and evolving and iterating on. Um, from your perspective, do you think we're kind of meeting those goals that we set out to accomplish?
Gosh, that's such an interesting way to frame it. I think so, but partially, of course, and I think about the broader, Telegraph mission and the things that all the other team members are working on that I think make it more navigable in a much more practical way. The demurrage pieces, the billing pieces, the visibility pieces, So this is one small contribution, I hope, to that broader effort. And in that sense, I think we are, thinking about, why do I think we got there? We've worked now with some of the same data sets for, three separate reports. And I think we really have a handle on trend and momentum in the railroading market. So, like where volumes are at and where they're going. We really have a handle on seasonality and cyclicality across different commodities. So, and that all contributes to the accuracy that we talk about in the report. So, as far as helping people understand volumes on the railroad, I think we have made some progress there that I hope, readers are appreciating.
And one of the interesting things you were very thorough and thoughtful about. We should always measure our accuracy every time we're kind of taking that in. And so I know we'll talk about accuracy a little bit later. But one of the things you've also shared, that rail suffers from, we kind of exist in a tale of two cities. The storied indicators where you begin to do some trend analysis, but we're also beneficiaries of some live real time data of what is happening minute to minute, day to day, week to week within the broader rail industry that eventually builds into what we typically see on a monthly or a quarterly basis. Tell me a little bit about some of the trends and seasonal cyclicality that you've started to see now that we're in version.
Sure. Gosh. So, it really depends on which measure you're looking at, but, starting at the top with the carload and the intermodal, I think with carload, we've seen long-term decline with some variability around harvest season in particular. So that's something that we've been working on. With intermodal, it's been really interesting, particularly since, we started this a little under a year ago, but, the last year is really our training ground, if you will. So, intermodal is on a different trajectory, growth engine, if you will, and we're not the first people to say that. But we've been able to observe how sensitive the intermodal volumes are to what's going on in the world and what's
Right.
going on in policy. So that was a bit of a deviation from, cyclicality. I would say cyclicality or seasonality, strong in carload. We leverage it to pretty good effect in terms of our accuracy. On the intermodal side, there's seasonality we've observed, particularly around Q4 and some of that end of year rush. But really, what is the most exciting and interesting thing to me is the sensitivity we've observed there to current events, both at home and abroad.
Right, right. And going back to kind of the weather forecast narrative that we've kind of thought about is There's always a wild standard deviation in what is predicted to happen, what actually happens, right? And so just because there is a chance of rain doesn't mean that it'll rain. It just means that there is some probabilistic outcome, right? So when we take that and we apply it to the space that we're operating in, what do you think is going to happen in the next kind of 6 months? Especially as we get into summer, which Q2, Q3 tend to be a heavier rail period.
Gosh, yeah, and I think that's what we're seeing, but with a little bit of context. So,
Sure.
headline predictions that are coming out of the draft, slightly softer volumes, carload and intermodal. But, I think it's important to put that in context. By softer, I mean comparing this year to last year. And, as, people might remember, this year, last time was the time of the announcement of the Liberation Day tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs. There was a lot going on in the market, including a lot of pre-positioning of goods ahead of the actual enactment of the tariffs. So, one thing I think, we see things on par or a little bit softer, but that's actually, I think, good news, really, because in some sense, at this time last year, some people were predicting economic fallout, complete collapse of global trade. Those things really aren't transpiring, and we're basically on track with where we were last year, despite numerous headwinds. So that's the first big headline, a little bit softer, but in a way that I think we can interpret as signs of resilience or good news. The other big headlines that I see between now and summer over the time horizon of our prediction, very strong for grain carloads. Just I
Okay.
think momentum in the
Okay.
market and some other facts really lead our models to suggest a really busy next several months for grain carload movement. And the flip side of that, a weaker next few months for chemical movements, for carload chemical movements. So I think those are the big takeaway headlines of the report we'll be releasing.
So to kind of distill that a little bit further, right? So we're a little more bullish on grain carloads, a little less bullish on chemical carloads. And so to kind of like think about that, one of the really interesting things about those supply chains, we'll start with grain first, is that there's almost like a mini supply chain where you're basically sourcing out of the fields, taking to a local, probably elevator or some storage facility, and then that inventory and capacity relative to the rates that are out there in the broader market kind of dictate how I basically you're gonna empty that elevator. Is that right? And am I thinking about that right? And why would that support better car loads?
No, you're 100% thinking about that right. And grain is such a perfect commodity for studying essentially the rail infrastructure and network because it's how it moves. So that's part of why we see a strong next several months through the summer. But I think a bigger thing is there's just some momentum also coming out of a very strong crop year last year and
Yes.
stockpiles that need to move. And I
Right.
think just to add nuance to your point, in part they need to move because I think, and the people who are making those decisions for their own product think that there's potentially weaker corn prices, for example, coming up ahead of this year's harvest. So I
Right.
think there's a lot of sentiment that that stuff needs to move in the near term.
So thinking about this kind of very massive intersection between what you're talking about in chemicals and then this broader kind of geopolitical mix of oil availability, oil price, oil processing, oil refinement, the difference between sweet and sour, and obviously those distillates coming out and kind of impacting the broader chemical market. You think near term it's going to be a softer chemical market. What are some of the factors kind of driving that, and how much is that really related to what's happening many oceans away?
Gosh, excellent question. So there's two things. One, just the momentum in the time series itself, which is just to say, what's been happening in recent history, suggests that things are not picking up there. It's not
Okay.
been a growth market leading up to this environment. And then it got hit with the energy prices. And we see very strong sensitivity between the input energy price and the production of chemicals in the US. So when we put those things together, there's really no momentum coming into the next 6 months, and there's significant headwind from energy prices that really led to, strong declines in the runs of the model that we're taking into the write-up right now.
I think one of the things that I've definitely been more thoughtful about recently is it feels to me that there is a disconnect between consumer sentiment and inflation, and maybe potentially what we're seeing in the headlines around manufacturing or the consumption of chemical inputs to drive a manufacturing process to deliver a good out there. Do you think, and I know I'm getting a little ahead here, but do you think there is potential more upside in the back half of the year for the chemical markets, absent some of the items around oil prices?
Gosh, it's a really interesting thought experiment. I think to take the energy prices out of the prediction for the chemicals market, so I'm a little bit reluctant to do it just because we know that's such a strong driver. If we do that and we think, all right, but let's do it, is there reason to think that because the consumer spending shows strength despite these storms, the chemical production and movements will too? I don't see it myself. I
Okay.
think when we're talking about tank cars full of chemicals moving on the rails, we're thinking about industrial production. And, I just don't think that America as a manufacturing economy has a lot of things to point towards near-term strength. And that's where the chemicals play. I think one of the things that's been puzzling is we think about the broader economy is, I think there's reason to believe that manufacturing is struggling, but consumer spending and stock prices are thriving. And that distinction between, what I would call the production economy and the paper economy, it has really
Oh,
been vexing as an analyst for a while. And personally, I love it that, we're trained to focus on the production economy because that's what moves on the railroads. And I just don't think there's strong reason right now to believe that there's a resurgence of production coming in the next 6 to 12 months, even if I do the thought experiment of taking the energy crisis out of it.
okay. Interesting. Interesting. We should do more of those thought experiments. As
Yeah, yeah.
speaking of thought experiments, I think you spent some time working on some lobster rolls at Mears last week. One of the things that I've always enjoyed and I think really changed the calculus of a really good rail shipper conference is how much pontification is actually grounded in what is actually happening. And so I know that you had a ton of conversations. Um, how are some of those predictions lining up with the report? Did you make any changes or any adjustments on some of the feedback that you've seen? And what were some of the responses to folks who had been reading the report?
Yeah, gosh, definitely. The upcoming report is influenced by those conversations, and so I just want to thank that community for, having really fun conversations, often over lobster rolls, some over drinks. Really tearing into these ideas with the pros who deal with it every day. And I'm going to come back to the energy crisis for a second, just because I do think it's the sort of the most important thing to think about as we think about what's going to happen over the next six
It's
months.
like a vortex that we cannot escape in these
Yeah,
conversations.
yeah. I went into it with a somewhat mathematical thesis around crude by rail shipments as a result of the energy crisis. And the
Okay. So
readers
for
of
the
the report,
audience, to pull this back a little bit to be abundantly clear for the audience, Dave went to the conference with a strong bias. Dave, please continue.
fair, no, that's fair. Went in with the idea that and people who have observed this market for a while will know, but maybe not everyone has. We used to move a lot of crude oil by rail in this country, particularly around 2014. It was something like 1 million barrels per day. So there was a time when there was a lot of crude oil moving on the railroad tracks. Since then, we've moved less of it. And for two main reasons: one, new pipelines were built, and
Hmm.
two, the price hasn't justified the cost of, the price premium of moving crude by rail over by pipeline. So, as these prices have really skyrocketed or, up 50% or more, as a result of the conflict in the Middle East, my mind started to think, well, gosh, at that price point, there's got to be people who are going to think, well, it's worth it for me to move on rail again. And the part of that is because I may want to try to export. that crude oil to, places where the differential between the U.S. price and the European price, for example, opens up new business opportunities. So I went into that
Welcome to Commodity Trading 101.
precisely, precisely. So I really thought, okay, there's an interesting angle, and you and I even kind of talked in our offline conversations about when might that happen, and if the mathematical models don't suggest that will happen, when is it appropriate to override our mathematical models if we have strong conviction that's the case? So luckily, I got to go have some lobster rolls and beers at Nears, and see, is that real? And what I
Mm,
heard back was not right now. And the piece that was missing in that thesis, and what the community was sharing with me there, was that it's prohibitively expensive to re-equip a tanker car to carry crude oil right now. There's all sorts of things you have to do with that asset that are, expensive and time consuming. And, the people that I was talking with were the people who actually make those decisions. And they told me that, at this price point, we're not thinking about it. At this sort of world outlook where we don't know how long this will last, it doesn't feel like
right.
it's worth our investment. So, they really pushed back on that thesis. I will say, maybe in a little bit of defense of the idea, when I said, okay, but what if we hit $200 per barrel oil? Then eyebrows raised,
What a
and they said,
wonderful thought
I mean, it's
exercise.
possible. Yeah, yeah, and it was really a helpful thing to take the essentially mathematically based prediction out into the airy light of day and talk with the experts who would have to live with it and hear, where it survived stress testing and where it didn't.
What's interesting here is you came into Nears pretty strong bias towards a certain idea. Also interesting that the folks that you were likely engaging with probably have a strong bias, which is informed on post 2014 Red Hot Chili Peppers, about a unique kind of perspective around how they would think about allocating the tank cars, the commodities, the spreads on the trades that they potentially could make, right? And so it was an interesting
Mm.
mashup of biases in these conversations. I'm really glad you were there and had the opportunity to have those conversations. Really, kind of two more questions for me really kind of pop up. And so you were thinking, like, we've kind of been pulling this thread of geopolitical pieces. When we think about the oil, like, is 100 enough? Is 150? Is it 200? Right? And there isn't really, like, right now any good like mathematical rationale to really kind of back that up. When we think about some of the emerging trends that you're seeing, what's the implications of the geopolitical pieces around USMCA or some of the other trade deals that we're kind of thinking about? Any interaction there, or is it kind of just fluff right now?
Well, I think very real interaction, and there's so much news going on that it's easy to lose sight of the things that aren't in today's headlines. And, I think for most readers, the USMCA negotiation is not part of their, daily news feed, but I believe it's important enough that it should be. So just to back into that for anyone who isn't following, there's a United States Mexico Canada agreement, USMCA, that really has protected a lot of North American trade from the tariffs that have been posed in the last year, and a lot of that stuff moves on rail. And people might be surprised to know how much consumer goods were actually moving into Mexico and back and forth.
Right.
And then there's a lot of raw materials that come from Canada into the U.S. at prices that allow manufacturing and home construction and all those important things. And that trade has been in large part insulated from the recent trade tensions by that agreement. That agreement will be renegotiated or revisited as scheduled in July. If it were to fall apart, I think volumes in a lot of important lanes would really suffer because it would just
Mm.
economically stop making sense to make some of those moves under a higher tariff regime.
Yeah, I mean, look, Larry Gross, if you're listening, I know that you've spent an entire career thinking about the imbalance of empty containers flowing into Mexico and then loaded containers flowing back. I mean, yeah, the entire reset that we would see from that would really, really be disruptive to the entire thematic piece that you've talked about before of nearshoring, which has been really enabled by that agreement. Okay. So, final question here, in thinking about the consist getting its final touches and being shipped out the door, what are some of the actionable pieces you would love to share with some of the readers, and why should people get excited about this third iteration?
Gosh, so why I think people should be excited is we're doing well with our predictions on volumes, and we're holding ourselves accountable. So we're sharing what we predict and how well it performed. So I think for free, that's worth your time if you're interested in it. And with each iteration, we're adding more detail and nuance. So we're bringing
Yes.
in new commodity sectors this time that didn't exist in the previous reports, and we're going to continue to expand that way. So it really, I think, gives people an even more detailed picture of what they can expect in their business over the next 6 months. So and at the current price point, I think it's worth it. Um,
Yeah.
the takeaways that I would want people to distill from it, one, we see, I think, sort of a closing window on the shippers market that many of our readers have enjoyed for the last year plus. And we see that in a lot of ways. One, you would say, well, you're seeing these slightly declining volumes in your forecast. How does that mean that that's changing? I think it goes back to this year being like last year is a sign that there's more freight moving into the market. There's also
Yes.
signs
Yes.
around, what we see in the truckload market happening right now. I think there's real reason to believe, and we can provide the substantiation of that in the text, that things may be returning more towards the carrier's favor. Now, obviously, in railroading, that balance of power is much different than it is in trucking, but that's
Very
one
different.
thing that I hope readers would, appreciate the early signal of that we're
Okay.
providing in the report. And then the other thing is around at the commodity level, where the opportunities are and where the opportunities are perhaps moving on from. And I think we talked a little bit about grain, chemicals, petroleum products here. We see strong grain opportunities coming up, weaker chemical opportunities coming up. Longer term, I think some of those things may flip. But I hope readers would take away the opportunity to sort of see around the corner, if you will, of which commodities will be moving between now and America's 250th birthday in July.
Yeah, that's right. Coming up, we're gonna have a big summer. Yeah, Dave, just kind of pulling that thread a little more and wrap it up. Demand finally now showing up and kind of finally being priced into the market where truck rates beginning to tick up. What is the lag between that and intermodal rates or the truck rates and the carload rates? There's always been some sort of lag. Then I think like as we begin to see that delta close over the next couple of months, like I think people need to be very aware of that. And as you know, was with some customers last week, and one of the thematic pieces we keep hearing is wanting to leverage the data that we have in market consists to continually think about reshuffling the deck, right? As commodities evolve, how many rail cars are we allocating to that? How do we want to handle maybe maintenance of those rail cars or the facilities that we're shipping into? Like, where is that all falling? And so it's been really good to share that narrative with customers. And I think that maybe shuffling the deck is going to be a thematic piece for the rest of the year. So with that, Dave, another really good, healthy conversation. Hopefully you are recovering from the honeymoon of lobster rolls at Nears and really looking forward to some of these unique insights that's going to be rolling out in this next version of the market consist. Thanks for taking the time to join. For those of you listening in, thanks for taking the time to listen, and feel free to send any questions in. And as always, we are happy to be chatting more in the latest episode of Talk Track from Telegraph. Thank you.